Hi guys, how's it going? Today we're going to be installing some suspension arms. That's going to include installing these suspension bushes. These ones happen to be Superflex ones, but whether you're using these or Nolithane or Super Pro or Powerflex or any of those instead of rubber, I might talk about the process for doing that, and I'll also explain the advantages and disadvantages to using these over a regular rubber bush. Other than that, we're going to get some brakes installed, then also get the uprights in place, so that'll be pretty good to look at. I know it's been a long time coming, but can't wait to get this stuff in. As always, you can follow on my Instagram, 105 Motorsport, and don't forget that we still have that Raptor controller, which is really awesome to give away. So please keep sharing all of your projects. There's some really cool ones coming up along the way, which is really great to discuss and see what people are working on. Let's get into it. I'm going to install the poly bushes in the lower control arm for the front left. What we'll see here is that these bushes, they press in here by hand, and then there is a steel sleeve or bearing that gets pressed in with the vise in between them. Typically they'll come in two halves like this. They both have some castellations on them, and we want to misalign those just so that we have a relatively even bearing material, bushing material thickness right around the mount. That way, no matter which direction that this arm moves in, you'll get a uniform response and flex from the bearing. Beyond that, look, it should just be a matter of pushing these into place. You can use a hammer or a press if you need to, but in this instance they should just push in. Beyond that, you need to just know we want to lubricate the surface between this bearing and the shaft on which it rotates. This bush should not be lubricated as it's pressed in, because we don't want the bush to rotate within the housing. You will need to lubricate the outside of this, because as we press this in, it is a very tight fit into the bushing. So a bit of a change of scenery here today. It's 38 degrees outside, so I'm doing a bit of work in my garage underneath my house on the suspension components. There are three main types of suspension mounts that we deal with. There are rubber, poly bushes, and then solid mounts, which are, ball, spherical ball joints or rose joints or whatever you want to call them. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. They obviously are a component that is fairly critical to the compliance in the suspension setup, and there is sort of some degree of tunability in which mount that you choose. Now, the solid mounts were an option on the Ultima. I didn't go for them because I'm building a road track dual duty type car that needs to work in a range of circumstances. Now, rubber mounts are obviously at the softer end of the spectrum, and that's typically what you'd see in most OEM applications. The main advantage for these ones is that you get good NVH control, noise, vibration, and harshness control, but then the downside being that you get quite a bit of compliance in that suspension. So if you're looking for a car that gives you good feedback and has that sort of immediate response, they're not quite as good for that. In the middle somewhere is where these poly bushes sit. These are available in a range of elasticities, right down from quite soft at the rubber end all the way up to quite a stiff elasticity rating on these bushes, which is probably more towards the solid mount end. Now, spherical ball joints, rose joints, whatever you want to call them, the good thing about these is that it will enable you to isolate your suspension tuning to the coilover setup. That's the main advantage with these ones. It's not really anything else that they offer over and above some of the other things in terms of wear or anything like that. That's sort of their main gig, and why you'd see them on most road cars. Now, because these contribute to the overall softness of the suspension, what you'll find is that if you're at the softer end, you'll generally get responses that are quite sort of nice to sharper inputs or shock loading. Particularly if you're already at the limit of sort of adhesion or close to it. If you had to have a steering input that was a bit imperfect, or you perhaps didn't match revs perfectly on the down change, you'll find that little bit of compliance will make the car a little bit more drivable and a little less likely to shock load the tyre and sort of break traction. That's where, when you set up a car and it is stiffer at this end of the range, you can start to run into a lot of trouble. What typically you'll find is where guys will go and change out things for solid mounts and not really take into consideration what they're doing, is you'll end up with a car that is hard to drive at the limit. It'll tend to be notorious for snapping into oversteer or very hard to control understeer, and you won't sort of know where you're at. You won't get a good feel for it. At the other end of the spectrum, you have cars like, say, new Mazda MX-5s or even some of the more mundane offerings, where you'll find because of the roll and sort of softness and plushness in the suspension, you can feel when you're coming right up to the limit and sort of play with that level of grip right at the extreme. The one thing that you would probably look at that in that regard, and the way that I look at it, is that if you set a car up quite stiff, If you're setting it up for, say, a qualifying lap, you can afford for it to be fairly unforgiving at the limit, because you're not too concerned about it being drivable over a number of laps, or if you need to have, or if you make a mistake, you're really just trying to get out there, do one perfect lap and be done with it. Whereas in a racing application, you want something that has a level of compliance, because inevitably when you are racing, you run into situations where there's a car that spins off in front of you, or you do make a mistake, and you don't want that mistake immediately to send you into the bushes because you're driving on the ragged edge all the time. It's just something to sort of be a little bit aware of. I know that F80 M3s, for example, in the wet, you would find that they would, because of their rush of torque load down with the turbos that were fitted to that generation of car, they would be pretty hard to drive consistently. And what people will forget is that if that limit is sort of scary to drive up to and you're not too sure of it, it'll make the car very unapproachable. And that's where you'll find that you really don't end up exploiting the limits of the car, because you can't go near them for fear of putting it in the wall. So just something to think about when you're setting up your car. I know a lot of guys don't think about it. They're a bit unsure. They maybe don't understand what they're doing when they're changing out bushes, or just simply solid mounting things. Just something to be aware of.
Right, so the lower wishbone's installed here in the coilover just to hold it in place there. You can see that these coilovers are rebound and compression adjustable, except they do not have the opportunity to vary the shock length to adjust your ride height. Now what they've done for this is, because that's made specifically for this car, you're able to adjust the ride height just by winding the spring preload in or down. The downside is that you basically are limited there for your ride height adjustment. You can't just keep compressing this spring to adjust your ride height, and you can't just keep loosening it. If you keep loosening it, what will happen is at full droop, that spring will become unloaded. If you compress it too far, you'll exceed what the basic corner weight is on this side, and you'll find that you get a crash back through the suspension because of that preload. Preloading the spring is not the way to adjust your ride height typically. Some fine adjustments are okay doing it by that, but if you are actually racing or anything like that, these shocks would leave a little bit to be desired, because what you would like to do is alter the ride height on your car so that you can change stuff like aerodynamic balance through rake and so on and so forth. So these are okay as a basic road shock. I wouldn't say that they're sort of a very high-tech option, but they're probably suitable for this. The only thing that I would mention as well is that you can see that we don't have a lot of travel here before we're into the bump stop. So you would see under certain circumstances, especially on the road, that if you are at full compression, you really have no other option but to send that energy back through the chassis. So particularly if you have solid mounts like we spoke about earlier, you're going to run into issues there with potentially breaking out your shock mounts, or the car will definitely bounce over bumps depending on what's stronger. If you go and research, Cayman GT4s, we found a few stories there, some horror stories there, with the shocks actually punching through the top mount and breaking out the whole aluminium mount that's there in those cars. So that's the type of thing that you run into on the road. On the racetrack, it wouldn't obviously be as much of an issue, because you can deal with a finer level of compression and sort of rebound travel, just because you're not running into those huge potholes or massive undulations. If you're going to use this on the road for a very fast road race car, these shocks probably would leave a little bit to be desired. You'd want a lot more wheel travel. Now, just what I was speaking about earlier in terms of the bush mounts, as you can see here, these are going to offer just that little bit more compliance, which is a lot more suitable to the road, and will probably just aid in that drivability, because when you initially get that compression into the suspension, you're going to get a little bit of forgiveness in it, and it's not just going to immediately sort of shock load the damper and potentially be juddery back through the suspension, or you get a lot of shake where it starts to break traction. So particularly on rough roads, that might be an issue. Like I say, for a circuit focused car, definitely not a drama. For a road focused car, it leaves a little bit to be desired. But look, I mean, these cars are obviously definitely at the racetrack end of road cars, so let's just accept that for the moment. But I think it'll be interesting to see how these perform in real life application, especially on Australian roads that sometimes don't have the best quality, and you certainly do have some ruts and that sort of thing to contend with at times. Now, don't take me to be highly critical of Utlima here, because I reckon they would have tried a whole heap of suspension setups, springs and damper settings to fine-tune this, to get it to behave as they'd want it to behave on the road and the track. So until we drive it, I really can't comment on that. And having a shock that's specifically, I guess, made for these cars does sort of lend itself to I guess, getting things right. I mean, just adjusting this to you, like not having an adjustable mount here at the bottom of the shock, doesn't matter if you are really just intending for people to run these at the factory ride heights. Now, what you'd need to look at here, if you fit any coilover to any car, this is the opportune time. Obviously I can't do this now, but to remove the spring. And what you would do is you would have the car up like this, and you would jack the damper up to its bump stop with the wheel on in the wheel well. And what that'll enable you to do is just wind some lock on left and right and start to see what sort of clearance you'll have in the wheel well, whether you need to roll guards or even cut some guard shape out, or perhaps if you do have an adjustable shock length, get a bit more ride height into the car so that you're not so when you don't bottom out under compression, you end up chewing out your guards, or worst case folding a guard. I've seen a lot of people fit coilovers not do that. Basically guess about their ride height, and then when they have a bit of a lock on, they have a bit of steering lock on in particular, and they drive into say a sharp driveway or up a gutter, you'll see that this compresses and it just folds the guard, and you're into a paddle beating workshop to resolve it. So yep, just one to be aware of. That's what I'd highly recommend doing if you are fitting a coilover to your car. I've done it on all of my cars to check the clearance is going to work. Obviously, when you do this, you don't have to check it right at maximum lock. I mean, you can be somewhat conscious of the fact that you're unlikely to fully compress suspension with it right on the lock stops, left or right hand in that case. Like I know my 5 Series, for example, it rides very low, and I would 100% fold the guard if I completely compress the suspension on full lock, but I know that and I drive accordingly. So, you have that sort of you have that in your head, and if you're going for something that really is more about style as distinct from performance, it's one to be aware of.
Alright, so just to discuss a few tools that we're going to be using, we'll be using a torque wrench. Obviously this one isn't the newest model. It is a deflection bar type, which is basically a calibrated piece of steel that as you put torque onto it, this will start to bend, which will force this gauge just to move incrementally along there and give you a torque reading. I don't use this one because I'm pretty sure it predates the Second World War. I got it off my dad. It might still be accurate, except everything is measured in, I don't know, stone per king's arm length, which is not very useful. The one that you'll probably see more typically now would be a micrometer type. You can actually look up, I imagine, 100 videos that will show you how to read a micrometer and how to set these. It's basically just you wind this in so that it'll match the micrometer reading on here, and there's a fine adjustment and a lockout at the bottom. These are arguably a little bit less accurate. The deflection beam type are generally the more expensive and more accurate type of gauge, but these are more than reasonable. Buy the best one that you can afford. Obviously accuracy does come at a price to some extent. I don't think you need to get the digital ones unless you're becoming an amateur engine builder or something like that, but by the same token, I wouldn't go for the cheapo ones, which are probably the equivalent to what lots of mechanics workshops use, which is the how many ugger-duggers on the rattle gun to do things up. So look, see what you can do with that one. Apart from that, you will need to use some thread locking compound on certain components. This basically prevents any loosening due to vibration or heat, expansion and contraction. They come in different temperature ranges and different, grip strengths. The red thread lockers are generally at the more aggressive range, so things that you won't want to undo very often and will potentially require heat or mechanical type devices to undo. This one conveniently is in a blue bottle, but is red thread locker. So that's great, Permatex. Thanks for that one. But otherwise, there is the blue one, which is obviously at the softer end of the range, which typically will just be for bolts that you might undo periodically and just want to be able to undo with hand tools. What you do need to do when you are working on any suspension or brake components, and I highly recommend this, and it is very important, it is to use a paint pen. So what I do is I will not use a paint pen until I have set the bolt torque or nut torque, and then I will mark that bolt. You want to mark between, for example, the nut and the sort of mounting surface behind, and that will enable you to see if this nut has rotated at all at any time after fastening.
What you can do with suspension componentry, as well as if you have, say, what do you call it, cam bolts in the bottom of your wishbone or something like that, that will set your geometry. You can mark that, and then that will give you a starting point for your base setup that you might have gotten from a suspension workshop, and then you can fine tune from there, and it's a good reference point. But yeah, definitely, I never ever paint mark anything unless I have it is completely torqued and it is done. It's a final check that I like to go through on all of the major componentry that's really important. Obviously, this stuff is really a safety issue more than anything. If you don't have properly torqued suspension components, and then you're doing 200 down the road and something lets go or doesn't do what it's meant to do, you can find yourself in barney rubble. So definitely something to be aware of. And there we basically have it. That's the brake rotor and caliper installed. I haven't cleaned this brake rotor yet because obviously there's going to be a bit of time before I actually am going to be bedding these brakes in. So I'll wait until I bleed the system and have it sitting down on the ground. What you will use with this is just any sort of brake cleaner. Be aware that brake cleaner does pretty much destroy any painted surface. So better to spray it on the rag and then just spin the rotor and clean that up. Otherwise, there's not really too much to talk about here. Just make sure you Loctite everything that you need to Loctite. Sometimes you'll use some copper anti-seize grease just on the back of this rotor hat as it mounts to the hub surface. That's just something that's worthwhile doing, because what you'll actually find is that these rotors tend to sort of freeze themselves to the hub, which can be a real pain in the ass, especially if you don't have, like a lot of rotors have here, which is a threaded hole that you can drive a bolt into to work the rotor off. You end up having to try and hit it with a hammer. It all just becomes a bit of a nightmare. So that is something that's worthwhile thinking about. My copper anti-seize grease is in the garage downstairs. So look, let's be honest, I'm not going to go down there at 10 o'clock at night and dig that out. I'll do that once I fit all of this together. It'll be the same process all around, so I won't dwell on that for the moment, and I'll get that done. In the next video, we'll be certainly fitting up the steering column, and I will show you how I'm going to mount that Raptor controller, which is obviously pretty core to me being able to do the giveaway for that Summit Technologies item. Of course, you know how to enter. My email and contact details are in the description as always. So by all means, please share your project, and it'd be great to see that go into someone's car and see them really get to enjoy their build. So anyhow, that's it for the brakes. These are obviously super awesome. I'm properly excited to really give these a go. I think, you know, 362mm rotors all around with these big calipers, these big 6-piston calipers, should haul the thing up pretty well. From what I understand, everyone who owns an Utlima, even with the smaller brakes, can really sort of get that proper race car sort of stopping power. So look, all really excited to try this. Until the next video, you know, leave all your questions, comments below as usual. I did actually sell my Ute this week, so I might actually do a quick video before that buggers off and just sort of, I guess, give that a send off. I've got a couple of new cars coming, so maybe I'll talk about those if people are interested in the upcoming time, because I think that would be pretty fun in the future too. Anyhow, thanks very much for watching.